So I had the good fortune when I was in the Washington Bureau of the Times to be leaked an extraordinary document. It wasn't about the war in Vietnam. It wasn't about the inner workings, in a way, of the White House. It was leaked to me, and it was what's called a presentment. You can think of it as an indictment by a grand jury. They call it presentment because in order for the grand jurors to issue the indictment, it has to be signed by the U.S. attorney in that area. And the U.S. attorney needed permission in this case of the Department of Justice, and John Mitchell, the Attorney General, refused to give him permission to sign it. It was leaked to me. Now, what did this indictment say? The most incredible thing, it said that sitting members and former members of Congress had allegedly taken bribes with regard to the construction of an underground garage at the Capitol. Amazing. Think about it. Well, maybe not so amazing these days, but then I had the entire, let's call it indictment. So I was the only one who had it. So I wrote the story in great detail to appear in the Times on, I think it was a Friday, but I don't remember. What I do remember is that I had to call various people to give them the right of fair reply since they were being named in the indictment. And the day before publication, I was sitting in the bureau, not many other people there in the afternoon. It was actually on the weekend, I recall, I think on Saturday. And the story was scheduled to run Saturday afternoon or evening for publication in the Sunday paper because, in part, that's when we had the most readers, the Sunday paper. As I was sitting there was an editor at the news desk, and there was I. I was sitting there, and I heard the ping of the elevator in the hallway outside the Times office. And this fellow came in a suit. He didn't come all the way into the office. He stopped at a desk where the office began. And he put down some papers on a table and tapped them and said, "Here's something for you." I had no idea what he was talking about. I just thought it was delivery. So eventually I went over and picked up the papers and found out it was what? It was a restraining order against the New York Times for publishing my story about the indictment and the alleged corruption. And imagine they were going to keep us from publishing. And it had been signed by a U.S. District Judge in Baltimore, Maryland. I then I hadn't been to law school yet at that point. I proceeded to do the worst possible thing. Yes. I somehow or other got the home number of the judge because the order wasn't signed, it just had his typed name. I called his house on Saturday afternoon. His wife answered. And I said, "Mrs. Thompson," in those days, "this is Robert Smith in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. May I speak to your husband, please?" She was a little taken aback, but said, "Just a minute." And he came on the line. And I said, "Judge," ever so stupidly and innocently, "Judge, I have a piece of paper here. It's got your name typed, but no signature. And it says the New York Times can't publish this story. Did you sign that, sir?" Can you imagine? Did I go to a lawyer? Did I do any? No, I went to the judge. And he said, "I did." He said, "Do you have a lawyer?" I began to get the idea. I said, "No, but I'm sure the Times does." He said, "Well, I would talk to them." And he hung up and I hung up. And then I did something even more stupid. I wrote a paragraph. And the paragraph basically said, today, Saturday, the New York Times was served with a temporary restraining order signed by Judge Thompson in Baltimore, prohibiting the paper from publishing the story. And I put this paragraph in as the second or third paragraph of the story. So not only now were we being prohibited from publishing, we were acknowledging publicly to hundreds of thousands of readers that we had been served and we'd been told, under penalty of law presumably, not to publish. Can you imagine? But publish we did. And then, I'm afraid, it's the part where I guess I nearly went to jail. And certainly I would not have been admitted to Yale Law School, or if I had been, I certainly would not likely have been admitted to a bar in California, New York, or Washington, or become a barrister in the United Kingdom. No! And it hinged on this event because they wanted to know who my source was. And of course I refused to say. So what did the judge do? Fortunately, he didn't have a lot more time left on the bench. And he said, he couldn't quite figure this out. He solicited the advice of the Bar Association of Baltimore or of Maryland. What should he do with regard to this Times reporter who would not identify his source with regard to a proposed indictment? I mean, an indictment is a secret document, But what do you do when the document is kept willfully secret by one of the people who's involved in the administration of justice in the United States, who indeed runs the Justice Department? Think of it. Think if you were in, say Hungary, and the Minister for Justice would not allow a prosecutor to issue an indictment against sitting politicians. What would you think? And what would you do if you were the journalist who had that indictment? So I said, oh no, the next step, federal prison. I said, well, I cannot give up the name of the source. So off the Bar Association went to determine my fate, or at least to advise the judge about my fate. And on the other end of the spectrum, the New York Times was getting worried. Scotty Reston, the executive editor, was consulting his own lawyer, Lloyd Cutler, who was White House counsel at one point, big-time Washington lawyer. And Cutler had told him, according to Reston, that this was a serious matter. And so I got a phone call. From whom? From Scotty Reston. And Scotty said, Bob, who was your source? God is on the wire asking me who my source was. Now, I promised my source I wouldn't tell anybody. Do I tell the editor of the paper? I think not. Promise is a promise, right? I said, Scotty, I can't tell you. And Scotty said, you can't tell me? I said, no, I promised. And he said, well, if that's your decision, I think it's a bad decision. And he hung up. And I thought, I'm not only going to federal prison, I'm going to be unemployed very soon, probably before I go to prison. And you probably say, did you go to prison? Did you get fired? No, I didn't get fired. Gene Roberts, the national editor, called me. The phone rang again. It's Gene, he said with his North Carolina drawl. I said, Gene, Scotty just called. I think I'm going to be fired. He said, well, let me just ask you one question. I said, you're not going to ask me my source, Gene, are you? He said, no. I'm going to ask you this. If the United States attorney in Maryland were called to the witness stand and asked if the indictment is correct and true, would he say yes? And I said, if he told the truth, he would. And Gene said, well, that's all I want to know. And he hung up. So I was okay, I guess, with the Times because they kept running further stories on the subject. I was the only one who had it, so everybody who repeated the story had to cite the New York Times. Did I go to jail? No. And why not? I think, without knowing for sure, that it was a sort of stratagem. Here's a federal judge who's retiring soon. I don't think most judges want to get into a contest with the New York Times or the media in general, depending on their proclivities, I suppose, in that day. So he's counting on the Bar Association to give him advice, which he can then say was their advice. The Bar Association took a very, very, very long time. Months, not hours, not days, not weeks, but months. And by that time, they ever so prudently said, you know, at this point, we don't see what would be served by pursuing this matter with Mr. Smith. No jail time.